everyone. This is Meredith again, and I wanted to bring you in for part 2 of my Outlander cosplay. I did not use that simplicity pattern for the second half of these items because they all seemed pretty simple based on other tutorials and the books, my own research, and I did practice runs for most of these items of clothing earlier in the year. Today we're going to do a quick run through my 18th century petticoat. We're also going to take a look at the stomacher that fills in the open neckline and the front lacings, a fichu to fill in my neckline, and some mitts that honestly it's been too hot for me to wear in any of these photos. I really recommend take a little extra time and do these extra accessories. It helps add a whole new dimension to all of your different cosplays and costumes when you have the right accessories. So right here, I just have a petticoat. I don't have the mitts. I don't have the fichu. And I can move around, but it just seems a bit basic. So I hope you'll join me today as we get through the last bits of this cosplay. And let's get to work, right? So one of the first things I had to do was even up the edges on this wool suiting that I ordered. I got it secondhand from a seller on eBay. They're trying to destash a bunch of their items, and they had all of this amazing wool suiting that they'd purchased when they were in the UK back in the 80s. Because this is yarn dyed and straight on the grain, I can actually cut right down the pattern lines on the actual fabric, which makes this particular petticoat so much easier than the last one I did. If you're wanting a full in-depth tutorial on doing these 18th century petticoats, I'm going to put mine in the card up above. You can always come back over to this particular video, or it's going to be down in the description. You can always go back to that in a little bit later. I also went through this and started pinning the salvage edges together once I had my hem and my waistline completely even. I didn't want to go through and add a bunch of extra padding to this, and I just needed to cut down those lines again to give me 2 panels, as well as cutting just enough before I measured out the halves to make some self-binding ties. I had just a little bit more than I needed to do the petticoat if I had used a different tape or something like that. But since I had the extra, I figured waste not, want not, and we'll cut some extra ties off of each of these panels as well. The bonus of pinning the salvage edges together to make the petticoat is I don't have to finish the side seams on here. I did go back through eventually and tack down the salvage edges around the opening, but it made my life way easier to not have to go back and serge any of that, or French seam it, fell it down in any way. And that's what they often would have done in the period, to be honest. There's a lot of situations where you see these unfinished salvages, just making sure that the fabric doesn't fray. And one thing that I really loved and sped this process along so much was the actual pleating. I did one box pleat in the center front and center back, and then knife pleats going out to either side. And it's so much easier to do that when you've got regular intervals from this plaid that you can just fold to the same spot in the woven pattern each time, pin it, and keep moving on. I think my pinning took me maybe 15-20 minutes versus my last round with one of these petticoats. So if you're into 18th century Scottish, I can highly recommend this. It makes life so much easier. I can't stress that enough. Now, I didn't record much of the rest of the construction of this petticoat because it's identical to the previous video I had done. You're going to sew these down. I used my machine. Flip your binding over, stitch that down by hand, and make sure you hem your petticoat, and it's completely done and ready to go. Super easy. I think I even did my hem on my machine just for the sake of this cosplay. The next thing that I had to do was take some of the scrap that was left over from cutting out my placard and make some binding to go around the edges of it. I kind of just eyeballed a pattern and drew it on my canvas, and then used a remnant from making my corset, which I will also link in this up above. The nice thing about making my own bias tape for this was I was able to get it to match perfectly. It didn't cause me any issues in that regard. And it's a really easy skill. Just make sure that you're cutting your strips on that 45-degree angle so you get the stretch. And the bias can curve around the sides of whatever you're needing to bind off. If you're really enjoying this video, I would also appreciate it if you could click that like button down below. It does help this video get out to more people so that they can also start getting some inspiration for doing fun cosplays and historical costuming. If you haven't already, consider subscribing. I do have more fun adventures in the future scheduled here. In the meantime, let's take a look at how I always pin my bias together wrong the first time I do it. Then I have to go back and repin everything. It's just what it does. I will always pin it wrong the first time, look at it for a solid 30 seconds, and then pin it correctly and move on with my life. Do you have any just basic sewing skills that you also have that kind of problem with, where you're going to always do it wrong the first time and then magically you'll get it right as soon as you see what you did? If you do, tell me about it down in the comments section. I would love to hear what your little sewing tick is. As for my stomacher, I went and sewed it together with my 2 layers of canvas and my silk cover and the binding on my sewing machine. And then I went back around the other side of my bias tape and tacked it down by hand. I wanted it to have a little bit of canvas because the silk is pretty lightweight, and that helps give it just enough body that it's going to hold up to being pinned onto my corset pretty frequently. I did something a little bit different with these mitts versus the spring floral ones I made with wool earlier this year. I decided because the wool I'm using is a little bit rougher, I wanted to try and put a lining on it. So this is a linen remnant that I had cut up using that same pattern I had before. I'll go ahead and also link that video if you want a full in-depth tutorial on how to make these mitts and where to go find those patterns. But the biggest difference that it came down to with the lining, I still put the thumbs on exactly the same way, but I'm not going to finish the long side seam that sews the entire mitt up, because the raw edges can just kind of face each other, and then you don't have to do that. It's almost like an almost bag lining. Not really sure how to explain that. But before I can get to putting it all together, I've got to get the thumbs put onto both of the body pieces and then start getting everything lined up and ready to go. Do be careful when you're pinning your thumbs onto the body of your mitt. No matter what you're doing with that, I always seem to stab myself at least once or prick myself with that pin. And if you're not careful and you're stabbing too hard, you could probably draw some blood. I think my thumbs might have been cut just a little bit too long this time as well. I didn't really care about doing super tight, tiny stitches as I slip stitched everything together. And that's mostly because the wool was a little bit too bulky for that. So I used a mid-weight worsted that was from my stash. I don't even remember fully where I got this piece. But it's just kind of thick and it's not as soft as my other wools. So it needed this lining, but at the same time I also didn't want it puckering as I tried to stitch the heavy wool down to the much lighter weight linen lining. You might notice that this thread is tangling a little bit more than my threads normally do. It probably has a little bit to do with the length I'm using and that I'm pinning everything rather than having basted it down. But a not insignificant part of this problem is that I was trying to use an older polyester thread that, even after waxing, was still fighting me quite a bit through this portion of the project. I don't buy the brand that this is anymore, really, just because I have always had this issue with it, but I also couldn't be bothered to go to the fabric store and search for a spool of brown when I don't frequently use brown. So it's probably left over from doing alterations for someone else at some point. I fixed the thumb being cut too long by folding everything down just a little bit more and slip stitching the lining to the wool. It made it a much cleaner finish and it was way less bulky than the unlined version of my mitts I did earlier this year. I kind of like the finishing on the edge of the thumb this way, so if I'm doing these in the future, that might be the one piece of my mitt that I actually do line going forward. The lining in general kind of was a pain for me, but this one section, it made my life way easier and it makes the mitts way more comfortable. It was way harder for me to try and do the fitting at the wrist that I normally would do for these mitts with the linings, so I just kind of left it straight. There's a little bit of extra gap around my wrist, but they also didn't super fit the mitts that Claire was wearing in the Outlander series as far as I could tell. Most of those were bulky knit things. And the last piece that I had to do was just hemming a really quick square that became a triangular fichu once I folded it over. I didn't want to do anything too crazy or fancy for my first one of these, just because I wasn't sure if I was going to use it a lot, and with the size I used, I can reuse it for my other historical cosplays. But there we go. I give you Claire Fraser from Season 1 of Outlander. I really hope you've enjoyed watching me work on this project over the last couple months. I do have some other 18th century projects in the works, but they're going to probably be put on the back burner while I work on some Italian Renaissance for an event that I have coming up locally here in December. In the meantime, again, thank you for watching. Definitely comment below if you have your own fun 18th century projects you want to work on. And share this video if you're finding it helpful to other people. Have a great day, and thanks for watching. Bye.